Thank you, Suhas. This evening we are joined by four eminent panelists. They are Dr. Haritosh. He is the head of a government virology task force. We are also joined by Colonel Splodge. He is an outspoken YouTuber running the Vaccines Are Mind Control channel and is a militant anti-government activist. We are also joined by Professor Alex, who is a research fellow and holder of the chair in Society Ethics Freedom at the University of Oxford. And finally, we're joined by Claudia, who is a spokesman of the Britain is Right think tank. I've invited them all along to discuss the current topical issue of freedom for people unvaccinated. I will be asking them to give a short address, each of them, and then we will have some open discussion. And as Debs was saying, you will have the opportunity to ask some questions and to make your points to the various different panelists. Think kind of question time or any questions. So our first contributor this evening is Dr. Haritosh. Dr. Haritosh, we are starting to get the pandemic under control with more than 60% of the population double vaccinated. As we remove lockdown restrictions, is there a risk in allowing the unvaccinated people to interact freely with others?
Thank you, panel moderator, Mr. Kidd. Let me ask all of you, how many people does it take to spread this virus to million people? If you're not wrong, the answer is one. One person is enough to spread this virus to million. And I certainly, as the head of virology department, I would really like to advocate that we keep the restriction until everyone, and I repeat, everyone is vaccinated. We have had enough bloodshed done last year. We don't want to take any more chances. So I strongly believe that everybody should be vaccinated, or if they are not doing that, probably prosecuted as well.
Thank you, Dr. Haritosh. Colonel Splodge, you've heard an expert in the field explain the importance of the issue. You have made what many people would consider to be outrageous, unfounded assertions that COVID is an invention of the government to control us. Why should we listen to you? Do you have any evidence to back up your claim?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mark can't make it tonight, so he's handed it over to me. Now, I'm in charge of a small army of people whose job it is to keep the country safe against those people, nincompoops, who decide to get themselves vaccinated. I've never heard so much hogwash. Vaccination? What a load of old poppycock. In my day, we had the stiff upper lip. We walked with our head held high. We certainly didn't have time off work for one day COVID vaccine and then the next day recovering. What a load of namby-pamby nonsense. Now, I put it to you that there's nothing quite like a stiff walk and some fresh air to really clear the lungs. And if you're worried about getting too close, stand 10 feet apart from the nearest person to you. That way you won't be spreading all this nonsense around. Really, the country needs to wake up and listen. I have so many people under me doing what I tell them to do and everything, and looking tall and looking the world straight in the well, wherever they look into. And I have to work out that they need one day off for each vaccination, which means that's one day they won't be marching up and down and protecting the country against whatever it needs protecting against. And then they need another day off to recover because they're feeling so listless. Really, we don't need that. We don't need it. We're a country of workers. We're a country of must carry on. And the whole process has to be repeated again and again with the second vaccination and later on this year. It's bringing the country to
Colonel, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. You're really not addressing the points. So Dr. Haritosh, what would you say to the Colonel's assertion that all we need to do is just simply stand upright and just carry on as we have? Is that sound medical advice?
Definitely not. And if that was the case, First of all, we have vaccinated 35 million people. I mean, we have spent billions of dollars and euros and pounds in researching and finding out the variation of this. And it took only one variant to become to like getting 20,000 plus cases now. Do you really think walking out and taking a walk will really calm this virus down? This is deadly. I repeat, this is deadly, and we have to take this really, really seriously. Please get vaccinated.
Virus is government here say it's letting us believe what they want us to believe, purely so they can make money and do what governments need to do.
Yeah, thank you, Colonel. I'd like to bring you in here now, Claudia. So the Colonel suggested that we should do what the government said. So your Britain is Right think tank has said that in times of crisis, the normal rules of society go out of the window. What do you think should be done?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. You've been witnessing everything since the first lockdown. What happened last year in March? Chaos, complete chaos. People going to the supermarkets, there was no food, no toilet paper, people going mental, everything was out of control. So what the government needed to do, it was put some rules in place to say, people, we need to manage you now. This is completely anarchy going on. We're gonna start putting queues, no more than two people in the small store, only one person at a time. Rules needed to be put in place to manage the situation. We managed to get out of the first lockdown thanks to following the rules. So as Dr. Haritosh mentioned earlier today, the government is putting rules in place, and these rules must be followed if you want to avoid the chaos.
Well, that's all well and good, Claudia, but I mean, the government is putting rules in place. You're assuming that people are following them. The government themselves aren't even managing to follow those rules. And I'm sure that Professor Alex would say that rules are really not there to be followed. So, Professor Alex, you've written that undermining the freedom of the individual undermines the freedom of all. Under what circumstances do the rights of the masses override the rights of the individual?
Thank you. I mean, we saw horrendous suffering last year from COVID-19, and the transformation our country went through was absolutely unprecedented. Our government made the largest restrictions on our freedom that we've ever seen, but ultimately this was the right thing to do. The differentiator to where we are now is knowledge. When we didn't understand what the virus was, when we didn't understand that it was even, looking back on it now, that they said it was airborne, or it wasn't airborne originally, and the WHO realized that wasn't the case. The vaccine is obviously a big part of this, but from the vaccine, that's what's working at a molecular level to really help us. But to answer your question, of the freedom of the actions of the masses, it's about when we don't have that knowledge, when we know that our health services won't be able to cope. We, of course, for the lives of the people in this country, we have to take big action. But as we learn and as we collect data, we can then make the decisions about it to people to get their freedom back. But the shorter we can keep these mass restrictions of freedom, the better.
Thank you, Alex, Professor Alex. So Claudia, Alex, who is an expert in this field, thinks that we should moderate what we do and allow certain freedoms, but restrict that. So what have you got to say to that?
So I agree. We should follow the rules. If the government is saying we are going to be all in lockdown, we must be on lockdown. That's what we should be. So we need to make sure that we stick to what the government is saying. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
So, Colonel Splodge, Claudia tells us that we should follow what the government says. What's your view of that?
How can we follow what those toffs in Westminster say when they can't even follow it themselves? The whole thing is wishy-washy. There's nothing clear. There's nothing there to follow. You have MPs who go up to Newcastle to test their eyesight, for goodness sake. How can that be right? How can you learn from that wishy-washy kind of example?
So, Dr. Haritosh, would you say that the guidance, the medical guidance from the government, is wishy-washy? Has the government got some clear health rules?
That's a good question. I would say, yeah, in terms of guidance, the government did have a clear guidance, did had a plan. When are we going to get into lockdown? How are we going to get out? And, when such virus comes, all of us are learning. The researchers and doctors are working day in, day out to find out what are the patterns, how can we best make the vaccine, and how we can minimize the doses. But you have to understand, we got into this last year. I mean, if you look at the history, the vaccine generally used to take decades and hundreds of years. In terms of that, we have got into a little less than 1 year. We had a vaccine rollout in the UK, and we have been going pretty well as per the plan. Now, we did had some stumble upon when we had this Delta variant coming up, but hey, this is life. We have to cope up with it. We have to adapt. Now, when people are not following, whether it's a common citizen like you and me, or whether it's a minister, the rules are rules. And if somebody breaks the rule, they need to be booked. I am of the opinion that if somebody breaks the rule, they should be taken to justice, because they are not, at this point of time, in this unprecedented time, we're not only responsible for our lives, we are responsible for everyone's life. A single wrong step can prove fatal for every one of us.
So have you got anything to say about that, Colonel? I would have thought you'd have interrupted then. That surely that would have outraged you sufficiently. Simply breaking the rules, not having a vaccine. Dr. Haritosh is suggesting that you should have the book thrown at you.
I reckon they should all join the army, which should knock them into shape. None of this rule breaking goes on in the army. Rules are there for the guardians of wise men and the ignorance of fools. Anybody who breaks them deserves to be given hard labor.
Yeah, for the first time in this panel discussion, I totally agree to Colonel's plot. Anybody who breaks the rules should be booked. So yeah, Colonel, you are on the right track.
So Alex, what do you think? Anybody who breaks the rules should have the book thrown at them, even if the rules aren't sensible, even if they're not reasonable. We should just go along with what the government says.
I mean, I think the risk is it's a slippery slope, isn't it? I think there's some things we can do around allowing freedoms in this country more than we are doing now. But this is not something that we should be enforcing. This is a free country. Within reason, people should be making these kind of decisions on their own. They should be following the guidance and the advice from scientists, of course. But down to these kind of very nuanced decisions, they have to make the decisions themselves. This is not something that our police force is going to be maintaining and enforcing.
So, what do you think about that, Claudia? With the police shouldn't be doing this. It should just be up to individuals. We're all adults. We just should follow guidance, and if we choose not to, it shouldn't be down to the police.
Mr. Speaker, the European football is going on right now. We had the match England-Scotland a couple of weeks ago. After the match, we had, I don't know how many, 1,000 of Scottish going back to Scotland with COVID. Everything happened within the stadium. No one was following the rules to keep the distance, to keep the mask. And this is the result of it. The police should have been involved. They should have put rules in the stadium to make sure that everybody was keeping the distance. You must have a mask. You must have a test done before you go into the stadium. The police should intervene. There are countries like in China, the very first lockdown last year in January, before COVID arrived to Europe. The people were locked indoors. Nobody could get out of the house because the police was outside the doors. The army was outside, and they managed to stop the pandemic spreading even further.
But at what price? This is a very complicated issue, Claudia. we don't live in China. People of this country have a certain expectation to freedom that we have built on over the last few years, and it could be potentially very damaging to our democracy if we let that slip. I mean, the army in this country, I mean, this is a disgrace.
Absolutely, but we are losing life. People are dying just for the sake of being locked indoors properly with somebody to managing people and say, you're not coming out for your own sake. We're saving your life and the life of other people by keeping you indoors.
Dr. Haritosh, is there comparable situations of numbers of people dying in this country that they are allowed to continue those actions? Is there, for example, severe restrictions on other personal freedoms that impact on health?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And if you see that now our policies, and especially the health policy, has been really, really adaptable based on the situation. If you are part of a cluster where we have a number of cases and a lot of that happening, then of course you have to restrict. Like and I was listening to Professor Alex talking about personal freedom, but if there is no person, what would you do with the personal freedom, right? So you have to make sure that you follow what is right in terms of not only you, not only your family, but all humanity in general. So, and also coming back to the point, we have not to say that we have not enforced that you have to take vaccine on certain day and time. I know there are countries where people do that. Our government has been quite liberal in that sense. We give a larger bracket, like people above 70 can now take that, people above 40 can now take, which actually give you a democratic right to choose when you want to choose. And I know there are some conservative who still don't want to take jab. I'm going to not, as a medical professional, I'm not going to advise, and I'm not going to be near to those person. And if we can clearly identify those people, maybe our NHS app can help us there. I'm going to be staying away until we get a pure solution to this particular pandemic, which is still ongoing. Remember, still ongoing.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't see any hands raised in the audience of people wanting to make their own points, but if there is anybody in the audience who would like to make their own point or ask any of our experts a question, you're welcome to do so just by raising your hand. So while you think about that, I'm going to put this point to Colonel Splodge. We happily accept all sorts of limits of our freedom. We are expected to wear a seatbelt in a car. We're expected to wear a crash helmet if we're on a motorbike. And if you fail to do that, you'll be prosecuted. And those are simply limiting your own or would be damaging of your own person. Why shouldn't the government insist on vaccinating people when there is good evidence for those vaccines? Why are you advocating against vaccines while we're perfectly happy as a nation to accept rules of wearing seatbelts?
I think all you need to do is learn from the example of let's say, our Asian community. They don't have the vaccine because they're worried about what it might contain. They don't worry about other things, but they're very, very worried about the vaccine. Now, is it right to force these people to have to be used as a human dartboard at least twice a year, possibly more than that, which means labour-intensive work?
I'd like to interject, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have somebody in the audience who wants to make a point. So Stevie, please interrupt the Colonel.
Thank you. I just think overall, I think if you want to get the injection, then get the injection. But if you don't, then don't. I don't think it should be a law. I don't think people should be forced to do it. There's many reasons why people don't want to get the injection. Maybe they just don't feel safe. Maybe they just don't believe in it. Or, you know, I know that a lot of people, I know there's no actual evidence on this, but a lot of women scared about fertility later on in life. And we don't know what the, you know, it's come out in a very short time. And I know that it's been lots of scientists have been working on the vaccine, but we don't actually know what the long-term effects are. You know, we're only a couple months in, 10 years down the line, people might be growing third legs or something. But I believe if you want to get the vaccine, get it. If you don't, then don't, and let's not force them to get it.
So, Dr. Haritosh, could you advise us what the long-term effects of contracting COVID-19 are for very many of the people who contract it?
That's a good question. Let me tell you, how many people do you know have died out of COVID-19. It's in millions. If I am not going to give you exact data, as compared to that, if you look at people who have got some sort of side effects, it's minuscule. It's really a handful of people who have got some bit of side effects. And in most of the cases, it's going to be a fever for a couple of days or maybe sore arm. I mean, I remember when I got my jab, I had a sore arm for a couple of days, but then I was fine. So in most of the cases, and you have to trust the medical system. There's no other way unless you have your own therapy or something like that. You have to go and you have to take that. Doctors doing, NHS doing so much of work, so much of research is happening. So you have to take that into account. No vaccine, no medicine is 100% proof. I'm not gonna give you a guarantee that no, you get the vaccine and you will never get the COVID-19 or you will not get any side effects. Because if you look at any of the medicine for any of the illness that we have, even for a fever, you get the medicine, but you never know whether it will work or not, or you'll get a side effect or not. So in most of the cases, I would say 99.9% of the cases, people get minor headache or fever or something. It might happen some cases, and that may be unfortunate. If you think about that, you're going on a road, you never know, a car may come and just kill you, right? So that doesn't mean that you don't walk on pathways, because that accidents can happen. So you'll have to have.
Thank you, Dr. Haritosh. You've made that point very clearly. Claudia, you think that we should do whatever the government advises? There are parts of the world, the Middle East, for example, Dubai, where during the most serious occasions, you were not allowed to leave your house, even to go for a walk, unless you had applied online for permission to leave your house. If the government was to advocate that, would you be in favour of that limit on our personal freedom?
Absolutely. It's not something that applies just to Dubai. In Italy, they are the same thing, exactly the same. You needed to have a certification to bring with you. So if the police stopped you, you could certify to say, I'm going to the pharmacy right now. This is my justification. And if you didn't have that piece of paper, you would get a fine. And that was the best way to keep people under control. We had people.
I can see you shaking your head, for Professor Alex. What are you concerned about?
I mean, there's a limit to these things. Keeping people stuck in their houses all day is not a recipe for a healthy society, and there will be resentment for our government and our democracy for years to come. I appreciate that there are 60 million people in a small island, but nonetheless, with responsible actions, we can still leave our house and not make contact without people, without the government saying yes or no to when we should do it. For me, this is a huge infringement on our human rights that wouldn't be acceptable, in the Western world.
Thank you, Professor. So, Dr. Haritosh, your task force has been telling us about herd immunity. And how once there are enough people vaccinated, the virus can no longer spread. Doesn't that mean that we can allow people who don't wish to be vaccinated to have contact with the rest of us?
That's a very controversial point, and thank you for raising that. Herd immunity, by definition, is that when there is a virus out there and it goes to so many people that the effect of it actually becomes negligible. I can certainly say that COVID-19 is not in that condition, and for that to happen, it has to go through so many different combinations. Just to give you some data, at this point of time, we have 4,000 variants of COVID-19. Do you think that having that herd immunity will help you out of all those variants? I'll probably rely more on the vaccine than on having that herd immunity. Now, this may happen over time, and I know cases where people, countries in South Asia or Africa where it has developed, but that has got to do with the genes and other sort of structural body structures and things like those. So I am not 100% sure that herd immunity will happen so soon that we just allow people to not get vaccinated. I'll rather have people vaccinated than wait for the herd immunity. And to the Professor Alex point, if we are not allowing people to go out and not taking the risk of people getting contracted COVID-19, that herd immunity may never happen. So rather than relying on herd immunity, let's rely on vaccine, which has been developed, which has been tested and has been
Thank you,
largely
Doctor. Thank you, Doctor. Colonel, many people treat you as a figure of fun. Even your name is comical. Others say that your message endangers us all. Why shouldn't we just lock you up to prevent the spread of your unscientific, unevidenced conspiracy theories?
If you decide to lock me up, you don't know who's going to replace me. I don't see the point in locking anybody up for being allowed to express their views. I think that the whole thing is mismanaged, is very strangely organized. If you're going to vaccinate, bring in one vaccination that will do the lot. Don't keep bringing in people every day to do different vaccinations. There's at least 4 types of vaccinations. We're all confused. Bring in one if you have to.
Yeah, Dr. Haritosh, anything to say to that?
I wish it was as simple as doing the grocery shopping, where instead of having 2 bars of chocolate, you take 1 large bar and it does works well. The vaccine works in the way that you take 1 jab and it takes a few weeks for you to develop that immunity system, and then it needs another booster dose. And we're talking probably about a 3rd booster dose. And the intent of that is purely to make sure that you don't get the COVID-19 vaccine. Now,
thank you, Doctor.
I appreciate Colonel's viewpoint. If it was scientifically possible, it would have been made so far. We might get a breakthrough, and as a democratic country, we appreciate the different viewpoints and that help us to bring more excellence to our work. But at this point of time, the answer is no.
Thank you. So, Claudia, there are people who say that the government are taking the opportunity presented by the pandemic to normalise restrictions on personal freedoms. What can you say to address the fears of those who think that the government will never take back any freedoms that we lose during this pandemic?
The government has given lots of freedom lately. Shops are opening again. People can go to theaters, restaurants, and look what's happening. Every day we got 7,000 contagious. So that's the trouble. Giving too much freedom at this point in time is dangerous. We are allowing people to fly back again. You can see the sky is full of planes now. The government is putting the rule that you must have at least both vaccination in order to go abroad. For me, that's a good point. The same thing should be not just to go abroad. What about to stay indoor here? If you want to go to the cinema, you should have 2 vaccinations done as well. Why would you need both vaccinations just to go abroad? Why can't we be safe here as well? You want to go to a restaurant, we want to see your certification to see, okay, you had a vaccination. You don't want to be vaccinated? Sorry, you better be at home then. You may be at risk of spreading disease.
Thank you, Claudia. So, Professor Alex, clearly, Claudia thinks that we will have those freedoms given back to us. What do you think? Personal freedoms are good, but society must limit personal freedoms when it impacts on others. Unvaccinated people are clearly a risk to others. Should we lock them up to protect the rest of society?
I mean, this is a tricky one. I mean, the government have already pushed back the relaxing of the restrictions. If I'm totally honest, I have confidence in the people of this country that we will not stand to have these these freedoms aren't given back to us. We all recognise that some things have to be done, and there is a balance. But I do not believe the people of this country will stand if those freedoms aren't given back to us.
Yeah. Yes, Stevie.
Just following on from Professor Alex's point, I think as well, if we go back into another lockdown, I don't think the British public would stand for it. I think they would actually probably revolt against the government. I think, it's damaging our economy, it's damaging people's mental health and well-being. I just don't think we would stand. I know lots of people struggled in the last one, and I think that
I think we got your point, but Claudia, what do you say to that? That whatever the government tells us, we're just not going to stand for it.
So what's happening right now? Freedom has been given back. No, all of it, some of it. People are going back to offices, and we have a rise in mental health issues where people feel they don't want to leave the house anymore. They feel safe and they don't want to go out go meeting people again. And they have to revert. This is the normal now, to be safe at home. So going back to the office, so it's okay, we're giving you the freedom back. You don't feel you want it because it's still dangerous out there, full of these people that don't want to get the vaccination.
So Rob, you had a point.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight that I see a lot of the points that are coming across, and I agree with most of them, to be honest. But I do think it's very important to acknowledge that it's quite clear the bipartisan approaches on this panel and the divisive language and nature between opinions that we are seeing. And I suppose I'd like to put it to Dr. Haritosh that it appears quite clear that the sound scientific medical advice has failed in its communication to the public. People like Colonel Splodge exist because of the failure of scientists, communicators, and the government to communicate this message effectively. What would you say to that?
Indeed, please
That's
go ahead,
a tricky
Doctor.
one, Rob, and I'll take it probably, and then ask our fellow panelist Claudia also. We are a democratic country. We give recommendation that then restrict. There are countries where people were actually locked down. We are here trying to recommend as good as possible. We are trying to educate people, make sure that their mental well-being, apart from the physical well-being, is also being taken care of. And we have been running a lot of initiatives. We also know that there have been, I would be lying if I said there was no business impact. So of course, there has been a lot of business impact as well. But I see that instead of focusing on that 1 or 2%.
So Dr. Haritosh, we're coming to the end of our time now. I'd like to give each of the panelists an opportunity to make some closing points. So Colonel Splodge, vaccines, is it something that we should avoid? Is it something that the government is imposing upon us? What do you think?
I think the government are imposing vaccinations without carrying out proper research to find out whether or not they work. And they're not being insistent enough that people actually do get vaccinated.
And Professor Alex, what are your final thoughts?
And this all comes down to choice. The people of this country have a vaccine available to them. We, like Dr. Haritosh says, we live in a democracy. We live in a free world. If Colonel Splodge wants to talk about this stuff, he can do. And by educating and promoting the right message, people should just know to ignore that message and make the right decision. But ultimately, it's their body. They decide what they do. And
Claudia, so Britain is right. Do we know instinctively what is right, or do we have to have the government tell us and enforce it?
Unfortunately, Colonel Splodge, people like him are driving people away from what is right. Right is following the rules. The government is got people with knowledge, we do research, all sorts. We know what we're doing. And then when somebody else come up with an opinion, different opinion, there are people following them and they are diverted to the wrong way. So follow the rules, get vaccinated. Let's
a bit of medical advice from you, Dr. Haritosh.
As I said earlier, until everyone is vaccinated, we are not safe. One person is enough to contaminate, if I may say, 1 million people. So please get your jab as soon as possible. NHS is there, government is there to help you, and we are working to get you out of this situation, but you have to help us too.
Thank you, Doctor. And I'd just like to thank all of the panelists, Professor Alex, Claudia, Dr. Haritosh, and Colonel Splodge. And I'll bring the session to a close now. And hand back to the continuity announcer from our TV program. And that's it for tonight.
Wow, what a session that was. I personally have conducted 2 panel discussions for my motivational strategies and dynamic leadership, but this has so far been the best. Thank you, Kit. Thank you, Dr. Haritosh. Thank you, Professor Alex. Thank you, Colonel Splodge. And Britain is right, Claudia, for that wonderful panel discussion. Let's give them a big applause.
So can I remind you